All right, well, as we've talked about then before, with this idea of our building project that we have, it really begins with a vision. And this is just by way of review, a clear mental picture of what could be fueled by the conviction that it should be. And we understand, we know that things aren't perfect as they are right now. And we know that they're not awful necessarily, but we're able to see that there is a picture of something that could be, therefore it should be. There becomes a moral obligation or a moral responsibility to make it happen. And so we turn to Nehemiah, who has a picture of what could be and what should be regarding the way that Jerusalem is in its continued state of rubble, because things should be better according to Deuteronomy chapter 30. And so he has the birth of a vision, and so he prays. The very first thing, when you have the birth of a vision, you pray. But in Nehemiah chapter 2, what we find is that when he's given the opportunity to say something to the king, he jumps on it because he's already made the plans. He already knows what to say, what to ask for, what he's going to need. He's already got himself ready so that when the opportunity came, he was ready to move forward. Last week we looked at Nehemiah finishing up chapter 2, moving into chapter 3, how we went about. He assessed the work that needed to be done, and then he brought all the people together and said, here's our situation, we need to get to work. And they said, let us rise up and build. And they put their hand to the good work. And then in chapter 3, as you follow through, it talks about all of the people, where they're working. And we noted how many times it talks about people who were working on the walls right by their house. In the most important section for them, that's where they were building the walls. And so we see you pray. Let me try this again. Take 3, right? You pray, you plan, and then you perspire, and you get to work. Well, what we're going to find as we move into Nehemiah chapter 4 is everything might seem hunky-dory at first, but problems are going to come. Now, this was read for us just a few minutes ago. Paneeth read this for us here in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verses 1 through 6. And we have our good old friends coming back once again. Sanballat and Tobiah are showing up, and they're trying to do whatever they can to ridicule, to mock, and to try to make these Israelites feel as if they're unable to do what needs to be done. But what's really interesting, notice to whom Sanballat is talking. You can't really, let me, I guess, bring this forward so that if you were looking at this, you can notice he's talking to the chief leaders, his brothers. He's talking to the army there in Samaria. There are other foreign leaders. Tobiah's there with them. Who's he not talking to? This isn't directed at Nehemiah. This isn't directed at the Israelites. He's not saying this to them. They haven't surrounded the city, and he doesn't have a bullhorn and saying, yeah, you guys know if a fox jumped on that wall, it would break down, right? I mean, he's not saying that kind of stuff directly to them. He's simply standing around making fun of the Israelites and their project all together in their own place. But here's the thing. Who hears about what Sanballat and Tobiah have said? The Jews. Nehemiah, they're getting discouraged. And we don't know how they heard about it. We don't know if people came and told them. We don't know anything about the scenario except that what was said by Sanballat and Tobiah became known in Jerusalem. Now, I don't think that Sanballat and Tobiah would have cared at all if Nehemiah heard about this. They're probably hoping that they would hear about this, but I do want to take the time to understand at least a principle here about saying things in secret or saying things not in front of others. Words travel. Ridicule that is made against somebody else, that travels. And it's a real danger. And I'm going to speak to the kids here for just a second. So you kids in the back, listen up. I want you guys listening here. for just a couple seconds here in the front, over here in the front. And adults, I'm talking to y'all too, all right? This isn't just for the kids, but I want the kids' attention while I'm talking about this, because you adults, you've already been through this, you know this, you understand this. They may not understand this right now. And so you kids, if you don't hear anything else, listen to this. Except in very specific situations, when you tell something to someone, you have to know that what you said is going to get to that other person. Don't say mean things about other people, even in secret, where you think, well, no one else is going to hear this. It's just us talking, and so I'm going to say this mean thing about someone else. I'm going to ridicule them. I'm going to tear them down. I'm going to say something about this, because what you say is going to get out of that conversation, and it's going to get back to the person or the people that you were ridiculing. Adults, is this true? Can you verify that this is the way that things work within the world? And here's a good rule of thumb. If you would not say something to somebody's face, then you don't need to say that thing when they're not around. That's called gossip. And there's a whole lot within the scriptures that talks about gossip and shows just how much gossip itself is a sin. And by the way, if they are right there in your presence, that doesn't make it okay to say mean things about them either. Just because you're like, well, it's not gossip because I'm standing face to face. That's just being mean. And remember what Jesus said, do to others what? What you would want them to do to you. Treat people the way that you would want to be treated by them. That's called the golden rule for a reason, because it's very special and it's very important. So if you, kids, you still listening? I want to know you're still with me here. Give me a thumbs up. Yes, very good. Give me a thumbs up. Let me know you're still listening here. If you would not want people to be mean to you, don't be mean to other people. And back to the point, don't just assume that because someone isn't standing around, they're not going to find out what was said to them. Ask these other older folks here, kids. Sometime they probably have stories of things that were said between people in secret that got out and how much it hurts relationships, friendships. There's probably some of those stories even here. You know, the Proverbs writer has something to say about this within the Proverbs of Salem. A fool's lips walk into a fight. His mouth invites a beating. Well, when does that happen? Well, it says a fool's mouth is his ruin, and that's walking into a fight, inviting a beating, and his lips are a snare to his soul. The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels, and they go down to the inner parts of the body. Now, all three of these should be connected together in your minds. The last one is not a thing in and of itself. It's connected with these others. When you tell someone something in secret and you have a good juicy little bit to talk about or to make fun of someone or to ridicule or in some kind of way, like Sanballat and Tobiah, when you do that, it may feel good. And you may feel good about yourself and you may think this is special. But what it's really doing is bringing you to ruin. It's the fool who uses his mouth in this own way, in whispering. Again, it's not good to talk bad about someone just because they're not around. It's gossip. They will hear about this. And if someone's doing something really bad, understand this, and let an adult know about it. That's okay for you kids. If someone's doing something really bad, it doesn't mean that you never say anything. But we're talking about the types of things that Sanballat and Tobiah do. The mean things that they try to say to make themselves feel better, to make themselves feel stronger, to make the Israelites feel weaker about themselves. Don't be like Sanballat and Tobiah. We want to make sure that we're not being mean simply for the sake of being mean. And folks, I hope we all know this doesn't just apply to the younger folks, right? I sing without the kids because it's a life lesson that all kids need to understand and they may not have experienced yet, but this is for everyone. So I hope everybody was listening, including myself, to all of this discussion about how we say things. Because just like the words of Sanballat and Tobiah made their way all the way to Jerusalem, it became a discouragement to Nehemiah and to all of the Jews who were working on the wall, and that's what these things do. Now, Nehemiah also found out what Sanballat and Tobiah had said about them, their wall. It was disheartening. And we know it's disheartening because Nehemiah prays about it. Don't mistake this. Nehemiah doesn't just brush this away. He doesn't just laugh it off. He doesn't just say, well, I guess that's your opinion. No, this is something that is important enough to him that he says, I've got to take this to God. And by the way, when any kind of a problem is coming up, what does Nehemiah do? He prays. He calls upon the great God of all creation to come in and to deal with this. This is no small matter to Nehemiah. The taunting has affected him. It has affected the builders. But they don't allow that to distract them from what needs to be done. Instead, he offers a quick, imprecatory prayer. That is a prayer that calls upon God to bring the curses of Sanballat and Tobiah back onto themselves. And then they just keep working. They were working. They were successful. They actually built the walls up to half the height. And what that means is this: even though they're still unfinished, folks, there are walls now in place. Half their height probably would be taller than a man, I would assume. City walls get fairly tall, as the case would be. So in other words, when it talks about it being half their height, yes, they're unfinished, but there are walls around the city. Make no mistake, yes, maybe the gates still aren't there. They still have a lot of work. There's still height to add, but there are walls around the city. Half-height walls are still pretty impressive, and that's what the Jews have done to this point. They were not deterred. The mockery did not lessen their desire to work, and they keep on working despite the mockery. So when ridicule doesn't work, we then move on to verse 7. When Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, and the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem, to cause confusion in it. So we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and we kill them. So you see a threat that is coming in. And you'll notice here, the phrase in verse 1 is exactly the same phrase that you have here in verse 7 when Sanballat and Tobiah heard. It's the same way in the Hebrew as well. These narratives are connected by this phrase. In other words, this is a repeating story. When Sanballat, Tobiah, when they hear, this is how they act. And when they hear, this is how they act. And so now it's increasingly becoming greater. It adds a few more names. The ridicule didn't thwart the Israelites from doing anything. So now there's actual physical threat. And the people in Judea and there in Jerusalem, they find this threat real. They take it very seriously. So how did they handle it? Well, first of all, you notice here in this section, what's the very first thing that they do when they encounter a problem? They pray. You guys see a pattern, by the way, emerging through Nehemiah? Are you seeing something that just keeps happening every time there's an issue, every time there's a problem? They pray. Remember, this is a people who went into exile because they did not maintain a close relationship with God. Prayer was not always the first response for these individuals. In fact, there were places early on, like in Joshua chapter 9, and remember there in verse 14 when they met up with the people of the Gibeonites, and they came, and it very specifically said they made a covenant with them, and they did not consult the Lord their God. They didn't pray about it beforehand, and that's what got them into all kinds of trouble with the Gibeonites. Not so in Nehemiah. If something comes up, they pray. And then they are prepared to defend themselves. And we're not going to read through everything through this entire section, but this section really details how it is that they go about preparing to defend themselves. They don't go out to fight in the fields. They station people at the gates. That is, they are using the walls in Jerusalem that are half height, but even half height walls are tall enough and strong enough to use as a defensive position. They've got enough already to defend themselves so that they just station people at the gates, and they have some kind of confidence that's given. And it works. It's enough that the enemies never actually come against them because they are prepared in some way. And then you see continued in verses 16 through 23. Again, we're not going to read through this, but Nehemiah changes up his plan in order to protect them moving forward. Now, he's not changing the vision, right? The walls still need to be built, and they're going to keep working, but the plan concerning how they do it is going to change. Because instead of everyone just working the way that they're always working, he's going to divide the people up. Half the people are going to be stationed night and day. There are going to be people who are stationed and ready to fight. The other half of the people are going to work. And so he's dividing his labor force in two. The walls still need to be built. The vision still needs to be completed. The job still needs to be done, but he's changing the manner in which he does it so that they can do it safely. And even those working on the wall do so with swords strapped on, ready just in case the enemies come. They're ready to go. And I don't know how many of y'all have spent much time in manual labor type of work, like building projects and walls and things like that. Mine is somewhat minimal in my experience, doing some stuff when I was a teenager and other things. But I could imagine trying to do all of that work with the sword strapped on probably would make things a little more difficult than it otherwise would be. But that's what they do. Again, you persevere. You change what needs to be changed to get the job done. Because the manner in which the work is done is fluid. It's changeable, even if it becomes more difficult, because this is a serious threat. But in verse 20, if you have your Bibles open and you are looking at Nehemiah, I don't have it up here, Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 20, you see their hope and their trust, their confidence comes because they say, our God will fight for us. They know that they serve a God who will protect them. They trusted in God to do their fighting. However, take note what that means. That doesn't mean that they say, well, we're okay. We don't have to do anything because God's going to do it for us. No. They station the men. They put the swords on their sides. They get ready for battle. They know they're the ones that will be doing the fighting. It's that they trust and they hope. Their hope comes in the fact that they believe God will use them for his fighting. That they are the instruments that God is going to use to get the victory. They firmly believe that God is with them. And so it seems as if the external threat really is mitigated. It's going to take them longer to build the wall. It's going to make things more difficult. But the external threat really isn't a problem. But there's another big issue that comes up in chapter 5. And that's problems that come from inside. In chapter 5, starting verse 1, there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against the Jewish brothers, for there were those who said, with our sons and our daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. And there were those who said, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine. And there were those who said, we borrowed money for the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved. But it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. As much of a problem as an external threat is, this may be the worst problem that Nehemiah encounters. That is people who are in the group, who are causing issues with other people in the group. You know, it's one thing when people who are not a part of your group threaten you, that causes you unite together and you put up a solid front and you're ready to fight against them. But when the problem comes from within, it's a totally different matter. The problem here is there's a famine that's taking place. They're being taxed by the king, which is the way that it is. They're in the middle of a building project, and there is a lack of food to go around. And who does this hit the most? The poor, the marginalized, the people who can't take care of themselves. And most of the people here are poor, but not all of them. Because there are some wealthy individuals here, the nobles, the officials, remember those whose responsibility it was to lead, to provide, to protect, to take care of the less fortunate around them. The leaders that's talked about in Ezekiel chapter 34 when he talks about the leaders of the land, the elders of the people who are supposed to be the ones who feed and protect and take care of, and instead they're the ones who are shoving the other sheep out of the way so that they could get all the food for themselves and all the problems that come from that. Yeah, these are the people who have been placed in a position and have the power to help. And although we have a tendency, I think, when we think about the Old Testament, we think about the Jews or the Israelites throughout the Old Testament, and if I were to say, what was the reason that God was so mad at the Israelites? What was their sin that they committed over and over and over and over again ad nauseum? What was their sin that just drove God so angry and drove him to kicking them out of the land? What sin might we probably say? Idolatry, right? That they kept going after the idols, the Baals, the Ashtoreth, the Milcom, Moloch, and all of the others. That they worshiped the gods of the peoples all around them. Yeah, that was one of the sins that God talked about. But it wasn't the only one. In fact, you look at Amos chapter 2, starting in verse 6. As Amos, he's a guy in the south of Judah, and he's been called to go up to the north and speak to the king in the north. And here in chapter 2, starting verse 6, he says, "Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment." Why? Because they sell the righteous for silver. They sell the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, they turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father, they go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profane. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined. The last part of this, I believe, is clearly talking about idolatrous worship, making a mockery of the temple itself. And it's talking about the religious prostitution that's attached to the altars of some of these other gods. A man and his son go into the same woman. It's the same temple prostitute as they're worshiping these other gods, the Ashtoreth and so forth. But what's the first part of this talking about? It's talking about the way they treat the poor, the way they treat the marginalized, the way the leaders, the ones who had the money, the ones who had the responsibility to take care and lead the less fortunate, how they were taking advantage of the poor. They're more interested in making money for themselves than they are in justice and righteousness. They are more willing to trade away the needy so that they can buy a brand new pair of shoes. And what are they going to do with that brand new pair of shoes that they just bought? They're going to take those pair of shoes and they're going to trample the heads of the needy down in the dust. That's what they are more, or that's what they care more about. I've had one person, a very smart individual, explain this by saying they are so greedy that they are looking enviously at the dust that has settled on the heads of the needy people who sit and beg and can't get around because they're immobilized and they're unable to work, they're unable to do anything, so the dust settles. And instead of looking on them with pity and with grace and with desire to help, they instead say, if only I could get control of that land on their head so I can sell it. And they just look at them as pieces to be used, monetized, in some way to trample them underneath. Folks, there's a lot within the prophets that speaks about this, how the people of Israel and Judah, how they treated the poor, or I should say, how they mistreated the poor. That is just as much of a problem as idolatry. And really, it goes down to the two greatest commands, doesn't it? Their problem of idolatry is a lack of love for God. How they treat the poor is a lack of love for neighbor. And in these ways, God brings judgment upon them. So coming back from captivity, perhaps they no longer worship idols, but what are they immediately doing here? They're mistreating the poor. And Nehemiah is quick to take action to deal with this situation. He brings official charges against those who are doing this. He brings an entire assembly and brings the nobles and the leaders, and he sets them down, and he upbraids them right there in front of everybody else, charging them. And what are these charges? Well, first, the charge of taking interest against their brother, usury, interest. That is, when they take a loan, they're making their brother pay back more when he makes a payment to repay it than what was borrowed. And they're doing that against people that don't even barely have the money to repay the loan to begin with. There's a sense in which, of course, this can be done to extract, but the problem is when you try to extract the max amount of money out of somebody as possible. When someone's in a desperate situation, and what they have to do in this situation is either accept a ridiculous amount of interest that they have to repay, because they have no other choice. They can either do that or they can die. Those are the two options. This is life and death for these people. It's either borrow the money and pay a ridiculous amount of money on top of it in repayment, or die, or their children die. And when the lenders know that and they try to make the number of repayment as high as they possibly can, this is extortion, and this is why you have laws like the law in Exodus chapter 22 and verse 25 that says, you don't do this to your brother. You don't treat your brother in this kind of way that you take advantage of him. By the way, as far as the laws and the law of Moses goes, you're not going to find very many laws before Exodus chapter 22. You don't find very many laws at all, because that's part of that book of the covenant. They weren't even beginning. The Ten Commandments don't come out until Exodus chapter 20, right? And then 21, 22, 23, that's the book of the covenant. These are laws given as the primary laws given to Israel even before they ratified a covenant in Exodus chapter 24. It's very counter to the idea of love towards a brother. And brethren, if I may say, there is nothing that specifically prohibits this. But I'm hoping you can see the principle. Sometimes borrowing money among brethren, it takes place. You have times in which someone's willing to lend, to give a helping hand to someone in need. And though it is absolutely best, as Paul says in Romans chapter 13, not to be indebted to anyone, there are times in which that might make sense. But let me suggest when that happens, if you're on the side of the one, and the side that is lending the money, you're helping the one who does not have, the purpose of this transaction among brethren is not to make money. The purpose of the transaction among brethren is not an investment. When you're helping someone who needs a helping hand, you're not looking for a return on investment in this monetary dealing. I would suggest it should instead be seen as benevolence. That if you have an individual in such a state that a loan is needed, then perhaps give the loan, but without necessarily hoping for repayment, not even requiring repayment. That is to say, if someone comes and the individual is simply unable to repay, that becomes a reality. And it doesn't become something that stands between two brothers and severs relationships. Now, this is not to say I'm advocating. Again, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that people should take advantage of this and borrow with no intention of repaying. That's just as sinful in the other direction. But that's not the issue of this passage. So we can talk about that when we talk about a different passage. But as for here, the issue that Nehemiah brings up is people taking advantage of the poor to pad their own pockets. Taking advantage of a crisis and saying, boy, I can really use this so that I can come out on the other side better than I am right now. And to whom do those downtrodden and trampled cry out to? They cry out to God. When you misappropriate your funds, when you take advantage of people, they will cry out to God, and God will hear those cries. Nehemiah is taking quick action against this practice before it comes to the point that the Lord brings judgment upon them and before this derails their work. And then, oops, I didn't mean to go forward actually. The other problem is selling brethren into slavery. As bad as usury is, this one I think is even worse. You know, in our society, we've been through this discussion of slavery in our history. We have abolished this practice, really abolished it based on principles found within the Word of God. So we understand the issue and the problem here. But where does this all come from? It comes from people who entered into agreements with high interest that we just talked about, entered into I'm going to take this, and either I accept your unbelievable terms or I die. So you accept it, and then you can't repay it. And what happens? Well, at this point, you've got to give a payment of some sort. So it becomes your child. It becomes your wife. Or you yourself go into slavery in order to make this payment. This is a problem. And Nehemiah calls them on the carpet because of this. The nobles, the officials, they took their payment in the form of slaves. They took their fellow brethren, children, women. They took Jews, and they said, fine, they will now be my slave so that your payment is fulfilled. And this goes back to what we were saying. When someone can't pay up on an agreed amount, how do you handle it? For them, they said, all right, I'll take my pound of flesh some way. It's going to be your daughter or your son. For us today, well, it's a little bit different. I'm not exactly sure, but an attitude that is more interested in taking that pound of flesh than showing love towards a brother, well, that is the issue at hand here in Nehemiah. And so Nehemiah not only tells them what they're doing wrong is wrong, but that they need to restore what has been done wrong. And he's pretty forceful about making proper restitution. And the nobles, the officials, those who were in a position to know that they were in the wrong, they're actually more than willing to follow Nehemiah's leadership here. Sometimes a large part of vision is seeing the things that are disrupting the vision from coming to fruition and doing something about it. You see, unity and peace. We've been talking about that this year, right? Unity and peace. Unity and peace are vitally important, but they should not come at the expense of greater problems that are disruptive. In other words, you don't maintain unity and peace by sweeping large problems under a rug and pretending that they don't exist, because those problems will fester. There is such a thing as a false unity and a false peace among people. There can be a lack of conflict where it appears there are no issues, but in reality there is a deep conflict involved that needs to be resolved. And what we need to do as we continue to prepare ourselves for the building project, we need to take a deep look at ourselves, and we need to make sure that the unity and the peace that we are experiencing is not coming at the expense of greater, deeper, underlying issues that need to be resolved. Sometimes conflict is necessary. as Nehemiah points out. Even when it seems peaceful, sometimes you need conflict to create a genuine peace and to resolve things so that the peace on the other side is a greater peace. And we need not be afraid of that. Now, I'm going to say it again. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Not everything is worth disrupting the peace. Can we all agree on that? Not everything is worth disrupting the peace. But there are some things. There are some problems that, if left unchecked, are going to become even greater problems the longer they are allowed to fester. Like Nehemiah, let's make sure that we deal with the issues in place, because if we don't, they can end up distracting us from our vision and keep us from building the walls. When it comes to our vision, folks, we need to first of all pray. When we see the vision, what could be, what should be, and it ought to be. What could be and should be must be. Moral obligation if I am to be who I am created to be. We understand that. We go to God in prayer concerning it, that He will use us. We then plan for the moment that that vision will come to a reality, so that when God is ready, we're not holding Him back. We then get to work. We perspire. We get ready to do what needs to be done, and we do the work. We put our hand to the plow and take care of what needs to be taken care of. But finally, as well, we need to persevere through whatever comes, because stuff will come. There are plenty of things that can and will distract us from our vision, whether these distractions come from persecution from the outside, or if they come from some kind of abuse that's taking place on the inside. These distractions need to be dealt with. Let us learn from Nehemiah and be bold to deal with the things just as he did. Let's trust in God, doing what we can as we move forward with our vision here. Let's pray together. Our great and amazing Father in heaven, thank you. Thank you for these stories we have from men of old who teach us how to handle distractions and problems as we strive to live to the praise of your glory. Help us in our own building project to build in a way that glorifies you with true peace here as we build your temple. We thank you for Jesus, the cornerstone, our hope and our help, and through him we put our trust in you. And it's through Jesus we pray. Amen.